In our lecture today, we're going to focus on sampling. Sampling is an important topic for auditors because, generally speaking, most of the auditing that we do involves looking at less than 100% of transactions. In fact, in the second paragraph of the audit opinion letter, we explicitly state that the assessment of internal controls, transactions, and account balances is on a test basis. We use sampling for a test of controls and direct substantive testing of account balances and assertions. Keep in mind that when we're looking at test of controls, we are doing this to assess the control risk, and we are looking at transactions. When we are using or doing direct substantive testing, we are measuring monetary misstatement in account balances and assessing the assertions. Each of these types of testing requires a specific type of sampling. We also have generalized audit software. These are programs designed specifically for auditors. In fact, in your book, you have a generalized audit software, which is the ACL program. This actually facilitates and automates testing of 100% of populations. It focuses attention on specific risk areas or transactions. We're able to identify duplicate items as well as missing items. And in fact, generalized auditing software actually helps facilitate picking a sample within a population. Let's talk about the objectives of sampling and risks associated with sampling. The objectives are, first, determining whether controls are operating effectively. Whenever you see the word controls, what we're looking at is we're looking at the control risk of the organization, where we are attempting to measure the risk of material misstatement. When we're looking at controls, we are looking at the transactions and determining whether controls over transactions are operating effectively. The next piece is estimating the amount of misstatement in account balances. This is our substantive testing, and in the substantive testing is we are measuring material misstatement or measuring misstatements in account balances. Now we have two types of risks. We have non-sampling risk. Non-sampling risk is simply the auditor reaching an erroneous conclusion for any reason not related to sampling risk. The auditor may make a mistake. The auditor may assess something inappropriately, but this is a risk that has nothing to do with sampling. Sampling risk is really what we're focusing on here. This is where the auditor's conclusion is based on a sample that is different from the conclusion if we were to have tested the entire population. So as we're considering sampling, it's very important that we have a very rigid, structured process to identify the sample items, because it's critical that the sample population reflects the overall population of what's taking place within transactions or account balances. Now we have an interesting table here. This is Exhibit 8.2 in the book. This is related to sampling risk for test of controls. And again, what we're looking at is we are looking at the test of controls. So this is the control risk. What you notice on the side, we have the auditor's assessment, and on the top we have the actual state of the controls for the entire population. So what we're considering is, are we actually making a correct conclusion? So as you look at this, if our assessment is low and the actual state of controls is that the controls are effective, then we have the appropriate conclusion. If our assessment of control risk is high, and in fact the controls are not working appropriately, then we also have a correct conclusion. What we're concerned with, specifically related to sampling risk, is our conclusion is different from the actual state of the controls of the entire population. So you notice that if the audit assessment of control risk is low, but in fact the controls are not effective, This is clearly going to lead to ineffective auditing, and control failures in the population are higher than the sample indicates. So we have the risk of incorrect acceptance of the internal control reliability. Now let's look at the other side. Let's say that the auditor assesses the control risk as high, but in fact the actual state of controls is just fine, that the controls are effective. What we have here is the risk of incorrect rejection of the internal control reliability. This also leads to audit inefficiency. We're considering also the sampling risk for tested details of account balances. So again, what we're looking at here is we are measuring the monetary misstatement within account balances. This is our substantive testing, and this is where we are drawing our conclusions as to the fair presentation of the financial statement. So we have the 2x2 matrix, the auditor's conclusion based upon the sample evidence, and the actual condition of book value based upon the entire population. So again, we could be right on both accounts. Let's say that the book value does not contain any material misstatement, and our sampling is correct. There is no material misstatement. We are correct. If there is a material misstatement in actuality and we identify the material misstatement, then we're also correct. But what we're concerned with is the sampling risk, where the actual condition does not contain a material misstatement, but in fact we identify a material misstatement. This is the risk of incorrect rejection of book value. And on the flip side, if we identify no material misstatement, but in fact there are material misstatements, this is the risk of incorrect acceptance of the book value. Clearly leads to audit efficiency, and this is certainly a risk, a significant risk that the auditor is concerned with. The auditor does not want to issue an unqualified opinion when in fact there are material misstatements. So going back to the audit risk model that we've talked about before, this is really going to be the focus of our attention. When we talk about sampling, we need to understand that there's different types of sampling strategies. We have statistical sampling and non-statistical sampling. Statistical sampling is where the application of probability theory and statistical inference, along with the auditor's judgment and experience in a sample application. In statistical sampling, the goal of this procedure is that we identify a sample that replicates the entire population. So again, the key word is inference. So we can infer what's going on in the sample to the entire population. This is absolutely the strategy that we're going to be using in most of our testing of the account balances. On the other side, we have non-statistical sampling. This is the application of auditor judgment and experience in a sample application. This is something that we might consider doing in certain types of test of controls, especially when we're considering fraud or other types of errors that are specific maybe to a location, to a specific person, to a time of day, to a day. Whatever we're doing in non-statistical sampling, the way I liken it to is attempting to identify that needle in a haystack. So we carve out the population in such a way that the sample is reflective of the concerns that we have, and we're trying to identify examples of the missing control. Now, this is a perfectly acceptable strategy. The thing that we need to understand with non-statistical sampling is we do not have the inference. So we cannot go from identifying something in a non-statistical sampling to the entire population. And I think probably this is one of the biggest misunderstandings students have and early auditors, is how important the sampling strategy is in terms of interpreting the results and extrapolating these or making inferences to the entire population. Attribute sampling is a type of sampling that we do generally as it is associated to internal controls. In attribute sampling, what we are doing is we are looking for specific attributes or characteristics of the population that is interest to the auditor. So we might be looking at procedure failures based upon selecting one sample and performing the appropriate audit procedure. A classic example of this is the control states that every check over $10,000 requires 2 signatures. That is an attribute that we would be looking at. That's a control procedure. So what we would do as an auditor is we would take a sample of checks over $10,000 and look for the attribute of the second signature. Attribute sampling is perfectly designed for the test of controls. It's not really designed for our testing of our substantive testing where we are measuring monetary misstatements. We're going to talk about some very specific steps related to attribute sampling. Number 1 is we define the attribute of interest and what constitutes the failure. Critical for us to understand the control environment and as we are assessing risk, specifically related to the inherent risk, what we need to understand is where are the risks and what is management doing in terms of controlling these risks. Once we understand what management is doing, is in our attribute sampling, what we're attempting to do is look for the attribute that determines the fact that the controls are working appropriately. We define the population from which the sample is to be taken. We determine the sample size. We determine the method of selecting the sample. We select the sample items and perform the test of controls, evaluate the sample results, and consider the effect on the planned substantive procedures. So when we're talking about 6, item 6 is what we're doing is we are using this information to evaluate the risk of material misstatement. Again, the key word is risk. Obviously, we need to document all phases of the sampling process so that the reviewer, as he or she is looking at this material, understands what's taking place. Defining the attribute, well, we basically have talked about that, is we need to understand what the controls are, why they're there, and what it is that we're going to look at. We need to ensure that the auditor understands what to look for. Seems obvious. You would be surprised how many people attempt to start a test of attributes. I'm not really sure what to look for. This is why it's absolutely critical that you understand the process before you start sampling. We need to reduce the risk of any non-sampling risk. And again, back to the point of non-sampling risk is we are looking at the right items. We're just not looking at the right items correctly. So non-sampling risk is critical. And again, it's part of the planning to understand what we're looking for. We define the population from which the sample is to be taken, the period to be covered, the sampling unit, and we need to understand the completeness of the population. So if there's items in the population that are not there, well, we're not going to be able to identify those in our attribute testing. So the completeness becomes a part of the testing before we actually identify the population and do the testing. Sampling risk, we identify the tolerable rate of deviation, what level we will tolerate, and then the expected population deviation or the expected failure rate, an anticipation of deviation rate for the entire population. So the key terms are tolerable rate of deviation and the expected population of the deviation. So the tolerable and expected. The first item is the sampling risk. So these are 3 elements that we consider, and in fact these are the 3 elements that we would plug in to the sample selection in the ACL program. Simple random sampling is selecting a random sample by matching random numbers generated by a computer. or selected from a random number table. This is done with, for example, document numbers. Systematic sampling, divide the number of physical units in the population and determine a uniform level. So if there's 1,000 items in the population, we've determined that the sample size is 100. What we would do is we would take every 10th item. Systematic random sample, the first item selected randomly from the interval. Systematic random sampling, generally speaking, works best when you have a stack of papers or a stack of checks and you're attempting to go through these to look for a specific attribute. Random sampling works best when, especially when we're looking at electronic information, so we can extract that electronic information. Now keep in mind that simple random sampling can be done with the ACL computer. Once we identify the sampling risk, the expected and tolerable rates of error is the system will generate a sample, and based upon the population in the data file, it will actually select the actual sample for us to use. Haphazard sampling attempts to approximate a random selection by selecting sample units without any conscious basis or bias or special reason for including or omitting certain items from the sample. Haphazard sample works especially when we don't have a strong basis of understanding the entire population. Many times I've received a stack of documents and you can sort of estimate how many items are there, but you certainly can't do this in a very systematic way. So in a haphazard sample, we're just randomly pulling documents out and reviewing these. Block sampling is selecting a sample that consists of a contiguous population items, such as selecting transactions by day or by week. Selecting sample items and performing test of controls. When selecting the sample, the auditor decides how to handle inapplicable, voided, or unused documents. If the inapplicable document does not represent the control being tested, it should be replaced by another randomly selected item. A lot of times what you'll see is items that are selected that for whatever reason don't really have any basis for the control, doesn't reflect any control weakness, and it really should not be a part of the sample. So we basically then just randomly select another item. When the selected items cannot be located, it should be assessed as a failure. If many failures are found, it should conclude that no reliance can be placed on the tested control procedure. Evaluating the sample results and considering the effect on planned substantive procedures. Again, this is where we are assessing the risk of material misstatement. Assessing the risk of material misstatement is critical to our testing because this determines the nature, timing, and extent of our substantive testing. So we're looking at our results both quantitatively and qualitatively. Quantitatively is determined whether the upper limit of possible deviation rate exceeds the tolerable deviation rate. So again, in our sample selection is we determine the expected and the tolerable rate. If we identify a sample error rate that's greater than the tolerable rate, then we've got a problem. Qualitative evaluation, which is probably more effective in many cases, is what we're determining is whether the failures were intentional or unintentional, were they random or systematic, they had a direct dollar effect on account balances, or were of such magnitude that a material dollar amount of errors could occur and not be detected. One of the interesting things is when we start doing the sampling, and especially what we're talking about here is we are selecting a random sample. If we identify things that seem suspicious or systematic, it's very possible that we may go back and look at a judgment sample or a non-probabilistic sample to identify specific issues that we uncovered in our sampling technique. This is especially critical as we're looking at internal controls, and especially as we are assessing the risk of fraud within our audit procedures. If controls are not operating effectively, the auditor will choose to rely less on substantive analytical procedures, more on tested details of those accounts related to identified control failures, and in an integrated audit, and again, remember the integrated audit is the Sarbanes-Oxley 404 testing that is combined with our financial statement audit, where we are providing an opinion both on the financial statement as well as the internal controls over financial reporting. So in an integrated audit, we may need to issue an adverse opinion on the internal control effectiveness. This is a critical point because what we need to understand is that in a financial statement audit, if the controls are not effective, the end result is this is going to affect the nature, timing, and extent of our substantive procedures. In an integrated audit, because the additional testing that we're doing also relates to the internal control effectiveness, is what we are concerned with here is our opinion that we need to write in regards to the internal control effectiveness. The final point that we want to talk about, and again, what we are dealing with here, is the sampling process for our testing of controls. Primarily what we're looking at is we're looking at attribute sampling. All preceding steps and related decisions regarding sampling process should be documented. We should allow for appropriate supervision and provide adequate support for the conclusions that are reached. And part of the supervision is a review of the documents that are the exceptions. We may even want to review some of the documents that are not in exceptions just to make sure that we have identified the appropriate conclusion based upon our testing. So what we've talked about here is we identified sampling, we've identified sampling risk, and then in these 7 steps is we've identified specific steps for the sampling process related to the testing of internal controls. In our next lecture, we're going to focus specifically about the testing related to our substantive testing where we are measuring monetary misstatement. Thank you very much for your time.